right. Welcome to the last seminar, the last colloquium of the semester. We're going to close with a bang. No pressure for you. Yeah.
That was great. It's a bang.
So I have the pleasure to introduce Dmitrij Rappoport. He's part of the faculty at UCI. Actually, Dmitrij and I, we are co-supervising Nico in the PhD program. Dmitrij did his PhD at the Castle Institute of Technology. Then you did a postdoc at UCI. Was it with Philip? With Philip. And then went to Harvard for 8 years or so as a research associate. Then went to the real world, so he knows what the industry is like 3, 4, 5 different places. And finally, he decided that the best was to come back to academia. So he joined forces UCI back in 2016. He's working with Philip Hooker in computational chemistry. And today he's going to be talking about his latest thing about computational chemistry he's done. So thanks, Dmitrij, for coming.
Thank you so much for introducing me, and thank you so much for coming here on a Friday afternoon. I've heard this is a mixed audience, so some people are chemists, some people are non-chemists. I'm hoping still hoping that I'll have a little bit for everybody, some algorithmic stuff and some chemistry stuff. As you just heard, I'm a computational chemist by training. And I'll be talking about dimension and sampling of chemical reaction networks. I was considering calling this computing chemistry discretely as the title here. And it's going to be all about discretization, and I'll get to that in just a moment. So the motivation for this work is trying to describe complex reactions. And complex reactions are everywhere. This is a slide for chemists. A relatively simple reaction like this, which has only 3 compounds here, this is an aldehyde and electron deficient alkene and a nucleophile, has an energy profile that you're seeing here on the right. And what I'm trying to convey to you here is that it's a relatively complex one. It's not a simple way from A to B. There is, based on experimental evidence, somewhere some 4 intermediates and 5 energy maxima that have to be crossed in order for the compound to be formed. And trying to find those is important for optimizing the yield, reducing waste, making more atom efficient synthesis, and just understanding chemistry more broadly. And so these reactions are everywhere in synthesis. This is synthetic reaction. They're everywhere. So this is a reaction that is conjectured to have started life. It's considered one of the important reactions in prebiotic synthesis of sugars, and it's been discovered in the 19th century by Butlerov. It's very simple, actually. You take formaldehyde, you add lye to it, and then for a very long time the solution will be clear. Like here you see here on the left. And then it starts turning yellow and brown, and then the whole thing forms tar. And so the interesting thing, the fascinating thing about this reaction is not just that it creates a number of compounds we cannot actually even enumerate. So there's a lot of experiments. We don't quite know all the compounds that are formed. But what's also important is that it has the cycle, and I'm showing it here, where the same compound goes in once and comes out twice. So it's self-replicating, and it's called autocatalysis, and it's a crucial component for life. And so this is called the FORMOSE reaction. So this is a very complex reaction. We're trying to understand this, and there's so many steps in this. And so if you ask a quantum chemist how to study this, well, they'll tell you, this is a standard answer from a textbook. You might have seen it from physical chemistry or introductory chemistry, is you need to study the potential energy circuits of the system. What is it? It's a function, it's an energy as a function of the locations of the nuclei. So I move the atoms around, my energy changes, and this function reflects that. Well, what's the problem with this? Well, the problem is that this function has 3 n coordinates, where n is the number of atoms, which means that it's incredibly highly dimensional. And so highly dimensional problems, and I hope some of you non-chemists will appreciate that too, are subject to what is called the curse of dimensionality. The number of possibilities is just so huge, you cannot treat them with the same methods you can use in 1 or 2 or 3 dimensions. It's just not possible. And then there's also a lot of other weirdness here. So you cannot do brute force search. Qualitatively, they're quite different. So trying to find all the relevant reactions on this potential energy surface, which is drawn here as a two-dimensional object, is actually quite different. This is not a very good representation, even though we see this in every single textbook. And so the fundamental idea, the little cheat code, so to speak, that that people try to use whenever dimensionality is too high, and that appears in computer vision, machine learning, wherever, is to say the essential features are captured by only relatively small number of degrees of freedom. So the system is inherently low dimensional, it's embedded in a high dimensional system. And so this talk is all about how to get to this low dimensional description from this very high dimensional one, which we cannot really hope to study in a good way. You can study pieces of it, and then people have been very, very successful in doing so, but getting a global picture for a complex reaction like the one I showed before is very, very difficult. We're trying to do better. And so what I will be talking about here is discretization. So converting this potential energy surface, which is a continuous function of the coordinates, into a network, a discrete object. So this is the cartoon version of that. The idea is we take, so this is kind of the projection of the surface, and there is dedicated specific points on that surface, which we then convert to nodes. And so there's nodes and edges, and the nodes and edges are states of our network. So this is the description. This is a little bit different, and people who study chemical engineering think about reaction networks in slightly different ways. This is a network of states. So basically the system can be in this state and then it goes over to this state and so on.
Yeah, maybe too early to ask, but
Yeah.
those edges are not the minimum maxima, because those are the very same things that you are actually trying to find.
Yes, so this is exactly the point. So it would be, thank you for this. So it would be kind of silly trying to take this potential energy surface and then convert it and discretizing this. That would be, you have to solve the problem in order to solve the problem. So luckily, we know, and this is where structural chemistry, the very, very old techniques come in. And so there is empirical ways of predicting what these nodes could be. So thank you so much for asking this question. We would not be able to do this if we had to know the potential energy surface a priori. But what we can do is have representations of molecular structures, which are the way we write chemical structures, molecular structures in chemistry. So just atoms and bonds, and we design the network using these rules derived from structural theory. So let me just say very briefly how it works. So for
that's a graph.
That's a graph. Yes, that's exactly what it is. Yes. So, but it's a graph that whose chemical significance is as follows. So each of these nodes has to contain exactly the same number of atoms of each type. So, for example, there's only 1 carbon, 2 oxygens, and 4 hydrogens in each of those, in each of these nodes. And so that's what I'm saying. So fixed stoichiometry. Stoichiometry is just the number of atoms of each type. So that's conserved throughout. We're not allowed to take atoms out or putting them in. And then the other thing is we take this graph representation of the molecule, and then we're allowing to each of these bonds, which are the lines here, to break in a specific way. So here, for example, I'm showing a very simple reaction where I'm taking this bond that is written with 2 lines, I'm breaking it, so it's only 1 line now. Then I'm breaking the single bond, which is the single line down there of the water molecule again, and then I'm forming 2 lines again, and then I continue doing this. So each step is a single bond formation or bond break, and the number of atoms is conserved. These are all the rules we use. And so this is how we can a priori create these networks without actually knowing potential energy surface. We have to ask ourselves, however, how well that describes the potential energy surface, and that's a separate question. I'll come back to this at the end. So if we do this, what do we get? We get a set of atoms and we get a set of bonds, and we're allowed to break them in any way we like, because bonds, breaks and bond formations are the elementary events, and we apply them exhaustively. So we get something like this, like a little pot of pasta.
No weighted edges.
Not for now, but I'll come back to that. But excellent question. So for now, we just get a, so each of these nodes is exactly created the way I described earlier. And each of the edges, there's a node? Yeah. Each of the nodes contains a certain number of atoms. And so this is for C3H6O, that's shown up there on the left. So it has 3 carbons, 6 hydrogens, and 1 oxygen. And so we get a network, and the network has 303 nodes and about 1,000 edges. And I'm allowing to go both ways. So I'm each bond that can be broken can also be formed. So this is an undirected network. The important thing about this, and this is where combinatorics come in, I have objects, atoms, and I have lines between them. So there's a finite number of possibilities, which means that this network is fundamentally very large. Here it's relatively small, but I'll show larger ones. But it's always finite. And this is going to be a useful feature. And that's actually not true for the reaction networks that I typically studied in chemical kinetics, where molecule A reacts with molecule B, then there is an edge between them, because there's no fundamental limit to what can react with what. Here, there's a fundamental limit, and that limit is given by how many atoms of which type we include. So far, so good. Okay, we made this little thing. Why is this useful? And I'm gonna make 2 statements here. These things are useful for 2 reasons. One is they're low-dimensional metric spaces. So this is gonna be the first half, first thesis. And the second thesis is they're probability spaces. And I'm gonna use this to say something about chemistry, specifically complex reaction. So, how big are the networks? Just to give you a sense. It obviously depends on the number of atoms. So here on the left, I keep so I'm plotting the network size versus the total number of atoms. There's always 2 carbons and certain number of hydrogens and oxygen. And what the individual lines mean, these oxidation, the formal oxidation states, doesn't necessarily matter all that much. What I'm trying to show here is that the networks go up to, in this case, 10,000. If you have 3 carbons, would go up to 100,000. And if I have 4 carbons, it goes on and on and on. You can ask Nico about how many nodes he has to produce with 5 carbons. So he's been struggling, not struggling, sorry. He's been doing really, really well, but he's been handling these gigantic networks. And that's all my fault. And so, and there is a differences between the network sizes and how they grow with the number of atoms, depending on how oxidized and reduced they are, but I'm not gonna go in detail on this. This is maybe for chemists. So so the first statement I'm making, they're low-dimensional metric spaces. So what is a metric space? A metric space is a set which is equipped with a distance function, which means that for every pair of elements within that set, we can say how far apart they are. So for a graph, especially for an undirected graph, there is a very natural metric, which is the shortest path metric, and it's been known for a very, very long time. So I'm showing here. Just taking as the red node in the center as my origin, and then all the blue nodes are 1 step away, the green nodes are 2 steps away, and so on. So this is very, very crude, but it's clearly a metric, and it fulfills, you can prove it fulfills all the properties of a metric. It's the distance of a node to itself is 0, it's symmetric. This is why the network has to be undirected, otherwise it wouldn't work. And the triangle inequality is also satisfied. So in principle, and thank you for your question, you could use any positive function, weight function, for the edges. And I have done this, but I'm not going to show about, I'm not going to talk about this, but it is entirely possible. It's actually quite useful for certain applications.
The triangle inequality does not hold with the weight.
It does.
It does. It does.
Otherwise, it wouldn't be a metric.
Yeah. It does. It has to be. It just has to be. The also has to be strictly positive. Exactly. That's the only. Yes, please.
Why isn't every node connected to every other node? Because I mean, you could technically take. These are the same atoms, right? So
yes.
you group them off in a very good way, and you could form anything else. So, however weakly they might be connected, initially at least they are all connected, right? All those.
No. So this is where chemistry comes in. So we have rules which prohibit us from connecting every atom to every atom. Thank you for this. This is actually something that we take for granted as chemists, but I appreciate that question. So each carbon atom, for example, let me just go back for a second and look at whatever this has to pop here. So we have 3 carbon atoms. Each carbon atom can be connected to no more than 4 other atoms. There is a limit. That's the valence rules. And if it's connected to 3, it has to have positive or negative charge and stuff like that. Each oxygen can be connected to only 2, and each hydrogen can be connected to only 1. So we have a limited number of possibilities. We cannot connect everything to everything. So this is not a complete graph. And so the structure of this graph, there might be like a generating function you could write to actually know what these networks are like. I don't know how to write that. I'm a little mechanic. Maybe there's a simple way, but the way I'm doing this is applying these rules exhaustively until this network doesn't grow anymore. And yeah.
So are the rules just purely based on the valency, or?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
Or is there something else to be?
No, I can show you the rules. I actually took them out. I had them written out. I can show you. Is it okay if I show them a little bit later? And
Overview. Overview.
Okay, good. And so, and for any, I just wanted to say that the rules that I'm applying here, that I'm allowing here by design, are only plus and minus. So I'm only allowing polar splits. I'm not allowing radicals. Not that it's impossible to do. It's just, I just want to make my life a little bit easier. In principle, it's possible. I want to do it at some point in my life.
But you also like a carbon positive, oxygen negative.
Yes. Good. So you're a chemist. Yes, I know. Yes. So there is, in addition to the rules, how many carbons and how many bonds you can have for each atom. There's also rules of electronegativity. So typically, in most cases, you would say that OH bond, for example, breaks up in such a way that hydrogen is positive, oxygen is negative. CO would be also carbon positive, oxygen negative. In principle, there are some examples, not that many, where you can break this called Umpolung. It's been known for quite some time. It makes it, again, more complicated, just like radicals. We're not doing this here. It's possible in principle. Another thing that, just for chemists who are really, really into it, there is also subspecies where you have fewer bonds. They're called sextet species. I'm not doing this either. It's also possible. Again, trying to make my life a little bit easier here. But does that mostly answer your question? Okay, perfect. All right. So big, low dimensional. So let me try to prove to you that they're low dimensional. And so this is where I'm going to get to the algorithmic. So the shortest path metric is the variant where all the weights are unity. So this is the simplest one. And so basically it just says how many hops, right? This is like street grid or something like this. And so we can try to study multiple different things, but I was trying to hammer the point home that the potential energy surface is a very high dimensional object. So let's try to quantify what is the dimensionality of these networks. And so this is a metric space. This is not a Euclidean space. In Euclidean space, you could basically just figure out by definition how many dimensions the Euclidean space has. This is not the case here. But for metric spaces, we have a notion of how far apart things are, or alternatively, how many things fit into a box of certain size. That's all about distances. That's what a metric space allows us to do. Metric space allows us to do. And so we can use a notion called the box of dimension that's called the box covering dimension, which only requires being able to get distances, putting things in a box. And so the algorithm goes in principle like this. I'm showing it very schematically here on the left. I have the network from before, and I'm asking the question, how many boxes do I need to cover this whole network such that the longest distance within that box is 2. So you can just count. In each of those, the distance is at most 2. And I need 3 of those. So, okay, this is nice. Is that the right number? And it turns out there is a minimal number for it, but finding this is empty hard, and we're not doing this. And so, but it turns out that there's a very simple approximate methods that allow us to obtain the number of boxes. Called, for example, the compact box burning method, and that's the one that we'll be using. And I'll say there are others like greedy coloring or maximum excluded mass burning, in which case you kind of greedily go and just say, I will exclude all the nodes starting from the current one up to a certain distance, and they're gone. and then I'm never coming back. So greedy method. So that's good.
Will be any difference instead of boxes you use
Balls.
balls?
Yeah, wouldn't. Yeah, that would be like a Hausdorff dimension, and I think it would be probably numerically slightly different, but I don't think it would be fundamentally. The idea that it's low dimensional, I don't think would change.
No, I thought in terms of which one would be easier.
No, apparently well, so I'm not a geometer, but what I was reading is that box covering dimension, especially these approximate methods, are so much easier than getting the Hausdorff dimension correctly. But if somebody wants to correct me, I'm willing to learn. I don't know. And so the dimensionality of a network, so this is actually what we're trying to get at, is, so what is it? And here we're just using an analogy to Euclidean spaces. In a Euclidean space, for example, a plane, like two-dimensional space, you take a square, a two-dimensional object, you have the size of the square, and then how many squares of the subsquares do I need to cover the original square? And that's 4, right? And so then I break it up in 3 squares, and then I need 9, and so on. In 3 dimensions, I need how many subcubes do I need to cover the cube, and so on. You get the gist. So the exponent with which the number of boxes goes compared to this length is the dimension. And so this is called a fractal dimension. The idea comes from was used extensively in like random graph theory, and we're using it here. They're not random. And so here, what I'm doing, I just took one of these networks, 2 carbons, 10 hydrogens, 6 oxygens, and I'm just plotting. It's a double logarithmic plot. No, not double. Yes, double. Goodness, no. Yeah, double logarithmic plot. I'm plotting the. Oh, I haven't written down the formula. I should have written it out. No, I'm sorry. The formula in this case for the box covering dimension is basically number of boxes is proportional some coefficient box length to the power of the dimension. And so I do a double logarithmic plot to get a dimension. And so I'm showing here 3 different methods of computing it. They're all approximate. So, and then I get reasonably linear plots. The bottom doesn't work because the boxes then are just, there's only one box to cover it. And what is the number? So that's the interesting question. Do we get a large number? So let's recap though. So this is C2H10O6. So the total is 18 atoms, right? So the total potential energy surface has 3 times 1854, if I remember correctly. We remove translations, rotations, 48 for physical chemists. 48 dimensions. So what's the actual number? Well, the actual number is down there is 2.87. So this is kind of the takeaway here. So these networks are metric spaces. They're weird, they're discrete, but they're very low dimensional. And we like this because low dimensionality means that searching is so much easier. And it's generally true. So I'm plotting the same networks as I was showing before, just for, so here's the network size, and then that's the dimension. And so the dimension, what I'm trying to convey to you is that the dimension in this case, even though the dimensional potential energy surface is somewhere in the tens or even around 100, the effective dimensionality of these networks is somewhere 3 or 4. Yes.
The reduction in dimensionality is actually coming from the reduction of the rules more than making it.
Very good question. You should talk to Miko about this. Yes, that's exactly what this is. But this is by design. This is an excellent question. Because remember how at the very beginning I was talking about the fact that there is intrinsic low dimensionality. And how do we get at that? So the rules give us the local view. This gives us the global view. That's so, but thank you for this. This is exactly right. And it's probably not the only way. I'm kind of thinking about other ways of doing this, but this is exactly what this is supposed to be. All right. So this was one, low dimensional, love it. Second thing that I wanted to talk about is that these are also probability spaces, and that's even simpler. So the previous one is shortest path distance. We kind of learned about this at some point. Probability spaces, meaning that, so this is a finite network, and I want to stress it again. So this has 309, I think, no, total for this specific network. So I can sample nodes in a way that's, for example, uniform and well-defined. I know exactly that I have, let's say, 0.1% of all nodes or some very small fraction. I can also sample edges and I can also sample paths. That's what we know. It's a probability space both for nodes, edges, and paths. And so what are paths? Well, paths, coming back to chemistry again, are reactions. So, for example, what I was showing you earlier is just a very simple reaction of addition of water to formaldehyde. So it's actually also happening in the FORMOSE reaction, probably in the opposite direction. And so you can see here at the bottom that there's multiple ways of doing this. So this can happen in multiple different ways. You can, for example, first break this double bond, then you can add the water, then you can break the bond between the oxygen and the hydrogen and so on. But you can also do it in different order. And the details don't matter. What matters is that there's 3 different ways, and you can even associate an energy kind of a diagram with it. This is not exactly like we do it in chemistry because each of those is actually an individual species. But the important thing here is that these are paths. And so since we can sample paths in a principled way, we can say how many reactions of this type and how many reactions of this type can be done. So we can construct databases and train our methods on without bias. And so that's the second kind of part that I'm trying to get at. So as you can, and the number of paths is relatively large. Obviously, you can go between nodes and in many different ways. But what is interesting is that many paths are actually quite short. So these are shortest paths between pairs of nodes.
And do you know how many paths are possible?
Not a priori. That would be nice. I don't know very much a priori at all. So if you have ideas, I would love to hear them. So these are small world networks. That's a notion that was coined around 2000, thinking about the internet and social networks and all. The 6 degrees of separation is this famous game where you kind of go through a network of people that you know, and each edge is a relationship of knowing somebody. And it says that you need roughly, the number could vary, like 6 steps to basically cover the entire world. I don't know if that number is actually correct, but we also don't need that many. We need maybe 8. So 8 is the shortest paths are a peak at 8, and then it goes down. So some of them are quite far apart, but it's not that far apart, considering that a lot of these networks have about 500,000 nodes, 200,000 nodes or something like this. So 24 is not, or something like this, is not actually that far apart. So a lot of them are short paths. So we have these paths, and these paths are short. So what we can do then, we put them together as subgraphs. So this is basically the idea. So we represent a full mechanism where multiple things can happen. And I was talking about complex reactions. So many things can happen. We represent them as paths overlaid with each other, which then form a subgraph here. So I'm showing another very simple reaction. So it's ethylene at the top, and this is the graph that comes out. And there's alcohol, ethanol at the bottom. So those who like beer might appreciate that a little bit. So this is the path. This is the overlaid shortest path between these 2 nodes through the network, and that's what it looks like. And so, because we can sample paths in a principled way, we can also sample subgraphs in a principled way. And so, in this way, we can say this network contains so many mechanisms of this type, so many mechanisms of this type, and we can try to figure out what is a good sample. So, what is, for example, to train our machine learning method to get the energies of these reactions or the kinetic rates or whatever it is. So this is the idea behind trying to sample these subgraphs. So this is, and I'm calling it quasi-reactions subgraphs, not just reaction subgraphs. Oh, and let me just show you a couple examples. So what do they look like? So if we take all the subgraphs with the maximum path length up to 4, so this is kind of a bubble chart. So this is number of nodes, number of edges, and the size of the bubble is how many of those I find. So this is the exact statistics. So if I wanted to train my machine learning method to predict reactions, I should train it on a sample of this, right? Where I'm uniformly sampling from this distribution because this is a distribution that's well defined. And so interestingly, a lot of them are actually very similar. So this 810 is the same that I was showing before. It's the most common one. And then 7-8 is this very simple one. This like 2 diamonds is the next most common one. They're all quite symmetric. Things get a little bit messy when we allow for longest maximum path length. But interestingly enough, certain combinations are still very, very common. And again, as you were saying, these are the rules, right? The rules enforce which combinations will be more common and which combinations will be less common. But you can see you have this huge tail of things. So just saying, okay, I will sample so and so many mechanisms from this type, from this bubble, and so and so many mechanisms from this bubble might not be the most convenient thing to do because there's too many different types. But luckily, these are undirected graphs. So we can instead pick a diverse set of those. So what does diverse set require? Some kind of similarity measure. So again, we need a metric. This time we need a metric that compares the similarity of graphs. And that is well known. Graph kernels are a framework that is very popular right now, especially because people also like to do graph convolutional neural networks. It's a relatively versatile scheme for doing this as the WEISFEILER-LEHMAN graph kernel. So this is the second algorithm I'm going to talk about. Hopefully you'll like that. So here, what I'm trying to do is, and it's shown schematically here, A, B, C, D, E, is compare the two graphs on the left and on the right, G and G prime, and they're labeled in certain ways. And so we can also label our graphs based on the rules that are involved there, or we can leave them unlabeled. Just look at the topology. And so the way we do this is, so in this simple case, we just we assign labels to each of the nodes. In this case, here we assign the node degree. And then the crucial step is the WEISFEILER-LEHMAN relabeling. So that was originally developed for an approximate isomorphism test of graphs, and still used for that. So what you're doing is basically saying, for example, the node 4, the left graph, has neighbors 1, 1, 3, and 5. And so then we give it the composite label 4, 1, 1, 3, 5. And then we do the same thing for each of the other ones. And then we just discretely, we relabel the distinct ones. And so in this way, what happens is that if you do this multiple times, you take into account the first neighbors, the second neighbors, the third neighbors of a graph. So for the isomorphism test, you can basically say if the labels after that procedure are the same, then I know that they're isomorphic. I cannot say anything beyond that. The converse is not true. Here, what we can do is we can create a string of numbers of indices of each kind. So, for example, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 happens so many times. So here I get a vector index, 2, 2, 1, and so on. So that means that the first label, label number 1, appears 2 times on the graph G, and appears once in the graph G prime, and so on. And then I just take a inner product of those. So this is a scheme that allows us to compare graphs in a very versatile way. You can compare just the topologies, in which case all the things that have these 2 diamonds are the same, or you can look at the rules, in which case, depending on which bonds you're breaking, you will get different results. And so since you have similarities or kernels, you can also do embeddings, or clustering. So this is, and you can just kind of look how many different things are there. So for example, for diverse sampling, or for a diverse subset, I could just try to figure out how many clusters I have more broadly, not just isomorphic clusters, but similar things. And I will just sample from that. And so, and here on the left, I'm showing in 2-dimensional embedding using UMAP. It's a manifold embedding technique of the graph, of the similarity between the subgraphs. These are 10,000 subgraphs based only on topology. So how many different types there are, and not surprisingly, actually, some of the common isomorphism classes come up again because they're very common. But it's actually not very interesting because you see this huge cluster in the middle, which is sort of the rest of it. But what's probably more interesting is the similarity that takes into account the rules, which means that two graphs are only similar if they not only have the same topology, but also have the same bonds formed and broken in the same sequence or similar sequence, I should say. And so here we get a lot richer structure. We have, so with the same settings, same 10,000 subgraphs, same embedding, but using the using this time the chemical information, I get 37 clusters, and so now I can start sampling from those. So for example, I can take 37 representative examples. Yes, please.
No, I was curious. So then you produce this on a 2-dimensional, so we can see this.
Yeah.
Clusters, though, but in higher dimensionality, or the same clusters are represented, or?
Well, that's a great question. This is a question for UMAP. The problem with, so what you get is a graph kernel, which is basically a similarity matrix, so that it's 10,000 by 10,000 matrix. And so usually clustering in this high dimensional space is not very efficient. So the typical method is to project it down to 2 dimensions. It's sort of the same kind of idea all over again, but that's not mine. This is how people do clustering pretty frequently for high dimensional objects. It's not quite known, to be perfectly honest. Usually the way it's justified is that it makes sense oftentimes post hoc, but that's the best I can offer. Yeah. And so what I was trying to show here is that I can define similarities. So picking diverse subsets, and that's been an important feature for constructing computational databases, is possible here in a way that is principled, I should say. And so one last thing that I want to show, why am I calling this quasi-reaction subgraph? And here's 2 examples, and this is just for chemists, so forgive me if you're not interested in that. So there is a very famous reaction called metathesis. Metathesis? I actually don't even know how to correctly pronounce it in English. Metathesis? Okay, good. Thank you. Not a native speaker. So what happens is that you have 2 alkenes, and then you have 2 at the beginning, you have 2 alkenes at the end, and they kind of swap groups. The way it happens, the way people typically understand it, is that you have a short-lived intermediate at which they form a 4-membered ring, which then, so it forms like this and then falls apart like this. That's how it's usually thought to happen. However, what is the shortest, what is the subgraph we're creating this way? Well, we don't know anything about chemistry. We don't know anything about energetics. So what does it do? It just breaks off a methyl group here, that's shown here on the left, breaks off a hydrogen, and then just swaps them. Just doesn't know anything about this, which is why some of them are reactive. They describe what's reactive, and some of them are non-reactive. And so the totalities, I'm calling it quasi-reactions because I don't want to claim that all of them are actual reactions. And so now, I was just reading it on the door of one of your colleagues in computer science. I don't know whose it was, that if you solve problem number 1, problem number 2 becomes problem number 1. So now our problem that we have to solve is how do we distinguish the 2? And you can do this either by knowing the rules. So somebody has to sit down and figure this out. This is obviously not scalable. You could also try to apply quantum chemistry to do this, but this is still ongoing. And this is pretty much it. So I wanted to talk about discretization. So potential energy surface can be represented as a discrete, large but finite network, which has metric structure due to introducing shortest path distance that allows us to define dimension. And these are low dimensional models, which means searching through those is a lot easier than searching through a full dimensional potential energy surface. I was talking about the sampling techniques, which are based either on just picking out from this gigantic set of subgraphs, or applying a graph kernel to figure out the similarities and then picking a diverse subset based on their similarity. And that's it. And I'd like to thank Miko, who's been working with me for the last 7 months, or actually longer than that, within the computational science program. I'd like to acknowledge Professors Burke and Philip Wojcik at UCI, who've been giving me important insights and interesting ideas. This work is funded by the National Science Foundation, and TRUMO is a program, one chemical program that I didn't get to talk about very much here. That is also supporting our work. And thank you. I'm happy to take
Questions for the meeting?
Just coming back to the metric,
Yes.
I think that because you start with a giant box,
Yeah.
so the box thing works better than the box.
Quite possible. Yeah. Yeah. Okay. I think you had a question.
Yeah, so I mean, I was curious about the thermochemistry bit that he just mentioned. That
Yeah.
would be one way to distinguish, and potentially in addition to the rules as well, right?
Sure.
Or rather, sort of gives priority to certain rules over the others, I guess.
That's exactly right.
Okay.
One way you could do this is basically going back to this idea where, so this is also a nice feature of this network. Those have the same number of atoms, which means that the energy of each of those is comparable. So I can plot them like this. And so what I can do is I can, for example, compute the energies using quantum chemistry, using Turing, or whichever your favorite the computational chemistry software would be, and get that graph and try to figure it out based on that graph. Either I did some work trying to figure out heuristic methods, which were actually based on weighting the edges, so that's the edges, the edge weights were then derived in a heuristic way from the energies here. You could also just try to machine learn this thing. I've heard that's popular these days. So there's probably different ways. There is still a problem. It's still not always clear. So for reactions where you know the mechanism like this, these energy profiles look reasonable. For reactions where something crazy happens, I don't know what they look like, and we'll have to figure that out. But yeah, thank you for this question.
Really cool.
Thank you. Yes. Oh.
Well, so I'm trying to work back to the more mundane kind of traditional quantum chemistry. So you're identifying reaction pathways to these
Yes.
these number paths, right? And then are you using the nodes as starting points for kind of routine optimization?
That's exactly right. Exactly.
Are the maxima here representative of transition states?
No.
Or high energy
The
intermediate?
high energy intermediate is exactly right. And so the idea here is, and I didn't want to get into this, it's trying to invoke the Hammond postulate where you're saying, you know, high energy intermediates are similar in structure and energy to the transition state. But that's all I can say at this point. But that's exactly right. Another way of thinking about this, I was trying to think, is that you try to interpolate between the two high energies, so sort of how people try to find a good starting point. But that's exactly right. Yeah. Thank you for this clarification.
Is there a need, do you think, to come up with a formalism for generating nodes that would represent the transition state?
Maybe. So this is, I think, yes. So, okay. The advantage of doing this is that it's very simple. I just write down the rules and they tell me what to do. For transition states, we don't actually know what that thing would, what this rule would be. But so here we're only talking about things basically, you know, 19th century chemistry, right? Like sticks and balls and sticks, right? What you could try to do is try to go back to the idea of like templates. People do this a little bit in organic chemistry, where they say similar reactions have a certain central motif, and then the rest kind of plugs into this. And you could try to do something this way. I haven't done this. I don't know if it will work. That would be potentially, that would be a great thing to try to do. And I would be very interested in that. But
to a large extent, actually, what you've done is you've identified where we can just go in with the quantum chemistry. Right?
Yes,
and what
that's
you've identified the two connected. Yeah.
yes, that's the hope. However, so I'm like,
I'm catching up with you.
oh no. This is great. The really hard question is what happens in Diels-Alder reaction. So the non-chemists ignore this. Diels-Alder reaction is a very famous reaction invented in the 1940s in Germany. It's used very widely. It's a reaction where there is no polar intermediates. So basically, there's many bonds moving around at once. This is called a conservative reaction. So then, I can't necessarily say that there was a thing in the middle, but I can formally decompose this like this, and it actually works. I've tried this on a bunch of like Diels-Alder and Kleisen and stuff like this. So this is a bit of a wrinkle, but it does get you in the right place actually. Okay. Please, you.
I'm just trying to just following Andy's question, try to imagine how to use this method to do like a reaction, chemical reaction binding, I guess.
Right.
Yeah, so like what would be the input information for this? Would that be the starting material or starting material plus the product?
So it wouldn't be starting material plus product. So there's one constraint here, and this is kind of the difficulty here, is that the stoichiometry has to be conserved, which means that the number of atoms has to be constant throughout. So you have to kind of know what your product is, or you start with enough atoms to produce certain products. And then you apply these rules. So here, this scheme is way too primitive because it creates everything and then filters it down. That's not smart. And Migo and I are planning to work on basically weighting the edges in a way that allows you to go certain directions with preference instead of others. So that would be the idea. So that would be more similar to one-sided kind of transition state searches. And then you kind of go up to a certain place, and when it starts going down, you potentially start a proper transition state optimization. That's the idea, but we're not there yet, quite honestly.
For the weights, how would you assign these weights?
So this is a great question, and this is actually a whole other talk, but let me just very briefly say there's no clear scheme, but there's a couple of requirements you want to have. So for example, you want the edges to be additive, right? So you want to have that's a requirement from the network model. So you want to have we're thinking about probabilities here, right? How likely is it to go to A, to B, and to C? So then the weights being additive here, which is required for having proper metric, means that it has to be the probability has to be some kind of a exponent to the power of minus the weight divided by some temperature or something, right? So this is one. Then the other is Hammond postulates, so what I mentioned before. So you can kind of take the energies into account and just try to write a formula that says how high does it go up. So I'm not saying this is a transition state, but I'm saying this is the energy that I know that is closest to transition state, and I'm going to take that. And then you're going to penalize how many steps you take. So this is kind of the idea so far. You can probably come up with better ones, but that's what I've been doing so far. And it actually works somewhat. I'm happy to show you. I don't think I have slides on this in this talk, but yeah. Anybody else? Yeah, please.
I'm familiar with box counting dimension, four-edge dimension, and there are bounds between the two, and even fractal dimension, house of dimension.
Yeah.
You're not using those, you're using this, all the ones that have not heard that are ad hoc for.
Yes.
Can you maybe, if it's not too complicated, just 2 minutes about how you compute those?
Yeah, sure. So this compact box burning, the way it works, it's a greedy method. So the way you do this is you pick an initial node, and then you build shortest paths from that node up to the box length, right? And so then that's your box, and then you remove this is box burning, and then you take another one. You basically randomly pick another one, and then you do the same thing, and
then you get the statistics.
You do statistics. So yeah, this is actually, I think we started doing statistics, and I did it like 20 times because this is obviously not an optimal number that you're going to get. And the differences are actually, the statistical differences are actually smaller than the differences between the different networks. So that's all we care about. So we actually didn't do too many repetitions. But what you do need to do is then you repeat it for different box sizes. So it's just like very greedy, simple method, and yeah.
And there are no theoretical results telling you that the box counting dimension for an infinitely large network will be bounded, because in dynamic consistent you have, I don't remember exactly what it is, but you know that the box counting dimension is smaller or equal than the correlation dimension that is equal to the Hausdorff dimension, and then that's smaller to the Kaplan-York dimension. So there are bounds that you can actually prove analytically. Do you know if there's results connecting these ways? No.
No, I'm sorry, no idea.
But in practice, you see that it match.
In practice, I see that the only thing I can say, this is
That's different.
the different approximate methods match. I actually don't know the exact number because we haven't implemented the full, exponential scaling algorithm for it.
And in the end, it doesn't really matter because you're just gonna run it to the nearest integer outputs anyway. So if this dimension could be
Yeah.
8, you will say, well, you'll be 3.
Well, yeah, so that's one thing. And then the other thing is what I'm trying to prove, well, not prove, but demonstrate. I should be really careful about prove around here. What I'm trying to demonstrate here is the numbers are small. Like if it's 3.3, so for example, I think the minimum excluded minimum excluded mass burning always produces dimensions that are slightly larger. It's fine. Like the qualitative trends are exactly the same. So I don't worry too much about this, but I should probably look into more rigorous results. I think it's
So the number itself, you don't care on the number itself. It just it gives you justification for what you're doing.
Well, right now it doesn't matter all that much. I would like it to matter more, and I want to think about how to make it matter more. To be
Right,
honest.
because I tell you that there is a lower dimensional space, but what is that dimensional space that you can project on that? That's the
Right.
how you do that, the principle of total decomposition,
Right.
type of methods to project into lower manifold, and that would be the key. You know how many you need.
Right. Right.
What are those?
Well, that's exactly right. So one thing that I do know, right, because these are yeah, you can do like statistical stochastic embeddings, right? You can do these things to create something, but that would not be rigorous. So I don't know if there's a rigorous way of doing this. That's a question I don't know the answer to.
Not like Dmitrij, thank you.